Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. Weird and Forgotten Saints. Patron saints are an important part of the Roman Catholic Church. Saints allow people to direct their prayers in a specific direction, with many devotees aligning themselves with the saint most closely related to whatever's bothering them. You can find saints for pretty much everything. Travelers have their own saint, thieves have their own saint, and so on and so forth. The theory is that since these saints are in heaven with the ear of God, they can pass your prayers along more swiftly to the Almighty One. The biggest issue these days is that there are a lot of saints. Through the years, many saints people used to pray to became obsolete and had to be quietly set aside. For example, Saint Giuseppe Benedetto Cortalengo, the patron saint of liver cirrhosis. Saint Giuseppe was born in Italy in 1786. He did a lot of charity work in the early 19th century, and he was a pretty good guy overall. He helped the poor, founded monasteries, and continued to be charitable even when he contracted typhoid. After he died in 1842, he became the saint of late-stage alcoholics. Saint Hadrian of Nicomedia is another bizarre one you don't hear very much about these days. He is the patron saint of alms dealers. Hadrian guarded a Roman emperor in the 2nd century AD. We're not sure which one. Then he converted to Christianity and was killed for his beliefs in Turkey in 306 AD. Legend has it he was tortured, imprisoned, then executed, but after his death he was worshipped as a saint for his military genius. He became associated with the army, and nowadays is the favorite saint of those who deal weapons on the black market. But perhaps the strangest of them all is Saint John Bosco, an Italian priest born in 1815. He worked with abandoned children, was generous and charitable, and in 2002 was made the patron saint of stage magicians. This was following a petition by Catholic priest Silvio Mantelli. Silvio was frustrated because there were no patron saints for modern performing magicians. Even weirder, Saint John Bosco was also the patron saint of Antarctica. Which saint would you pray to? Number 9. The Pope who hated cats. Pope Gregory IX was a real piece of work, perhaps one of the worst rulers of the Vatican ever. End of discussion. Pope Gregory hated cats, a hate shared by many in medieval Europe. Cats may be our friends today, but they were despised for a huge part of European history. They were despised so much that the Pope tried to kill them all. Pope Gregory was born around the year 1170. He studied at the top universities in Paris and Bologna, and in 1198 he was made the cardinal deacon of the Church of Saint Eustachio, thanks to nepotism. At the time, his uncle was Pope Innocent III. Gregory continued to climb to the ranks, although he still went by his birth name Ugolino. He was appointed the cardinal protector of the Franciscan order in 1220. He even became friends with the Queen of England, Isabella of Angoulême, and by the time he finally made it to the seat of the papacy and took the name Gregory, it was 1227. He was nearly 60 years old. There were a few truly awful things that Pope Gregory did that the Vatican would just as soon forget. He helped establish the Inquisition in 1231 to round up the heretics in Spain, and although he didn't allegedly approve of torture, he handed the overseeing of the Inquisition to the Dominicans and washed his hands of it. He also approved the Northern Crusades, which was a mission to convert and baptize the pagans hiding in the frigid European Northlands. But what Pope Gregory IX is most remembered for today is declaring that all cats held the spirit of Satan and needed to be killed. This bizarre proclamation led to the mass extermination of felines across Europe. Many experts believe that because of the Pope's fierce hatred of cats, the bubonic plague killed almost everyone in Europe. Without cats to kill the rat population exploded and their fleas spread sickness from port to port. And finally, if the historical records are to be believed, Gregory was an unpleasant person with an anger issue and an ugly personality. And now for number 8. But first I wanted to give a big shout to YT Teach and Elizabeth Warman. Thanks so much for watching and supporting EE. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Number 8. Priests of the Third Reich. The Catholic Church may have not had much to say during World War II, especially when it came to Nazis, but they were certainly busy. After decades of vagueness, controversies, and conspiracies, the truth has come to light. Documents have been revealed detailing how Catholic priests gave spiritual guidance to the soldiers of the Third Reich. Germany's Council of Catholic Bishops is the organization that's finally admitted to what happened during the rule of the Nazi regime. They released a 23-page document admitting that their bishops never officially opposed the war. Even more, they were complicit. Hundreds of priests joined Nazi soldiers on the front fighting lines. These priests were not there to pick up guns and shoot at the Allies, but to offer spiritual enlightenment. Between 1939 and 1945, churches were turned into military hospitals, nuns worked as nurses, and priests gave the Nazis moral support. If Hitler's screaming wasn't enough to get the German people jazzed about war, priests were there to whisper in their ears that they were doing God's work. Of course, the document was careful to say that the bishops may not have necessarily shared Nazi ideals or racial ideologies. Nonetheless, they gave soldiers who may have been misguided a sense of purpose, one they needed to continue fighting. One Catholic Church official, who hasn't been named, called the report a confession of guilt. The document even went on to say that many German bishops, even if not motivated by racism or anti-Semitism, may have been motivated by nationalism. Number 7. The sins of the Church. The Apostolic Penitentiary is one of 3 tribunals at the Vatican. This particular tribunal has the task of safeguarding the moral conduct of those working directly for the Pope. The Roman Pontiff is essentially the judge of all Catholic souls. He is the leader of the tribunal and is charged with trying cases personally or through his subordinates. To put it as simply as possible, the Apostolic Penitentiary is the ancient tribunal which hears the sins of priests, bishops, and even the Pope himself. It's the history of the Apostolic Penitentiary that's so dark and unusual. The tribunal was mainly concerned with people of extreme importance. We're talking about high-level members of the church and powerful nobles, royalty, and wealthy citizens. Those who had enough money and didn't want their name slandered would seek the Apostolic Penitentiary when it came time to get their sins forgiven. These penitents would be given a penance in order to receive absolution, but oftentimes they felt the penance was too strong. In this case, they would dispute their penance with the Apostolic Penitentiary. It was a way for wealthy and important people to barter for their eternal soul. They would argue over what kind of punishment they should receive for anything from murder to heresy. It was not so much about being forgiven by God, but being square with the extremely powerful Roman Church. Number 6. Ancient Christian Magic. The Sworn Book of Honorius may just be the Vatican's secret book of Christian magic. The book is a medieval grimoire, something which contains spells, incantations, and rituals. Many medieval grimoires also contain recipes for curses, instructions on how to summon demons, and ways to request help from angels. And while there was most certainly a lot of grimoires produced during the Middle Ages, some were a little more notorious than others. Almost all medieval grimoires were unanimously rejected by the Catholic Church and the Vatican's bishops. However, there was one that they didn't really mind all that much. The Sworn Book of Honorius, also known as Liber Luratus Honorii in Latin, was a grimoire with magic spells and rituals, but the Church never outlawed it because it was Christian. The Church didn't seem to have a problem with clerical magicians. This ancient spell book contains outrageous instructions on how to speak with spirits. It even offers spells on how to control earthly beings and bend them to your will. Those who would use the full power of the book were instructed to swear 9 oaths and keep all its secrets to themselves. The book even has an instruction manual on how to make a magic whistle for summoning spirits. So how did such a pagan-like book of spells become the favorite book of Christian mystics? Nobody really knows, just like how nobody really knows where the book comes from. It has 93 chapters and likely isn't more than 1,000 years old, but the real author is unknown. The best guess experts have is that Christians viewed the magic as acceptable because the spells weren't supposed to work without the blessing of God. The spells were driven by piety, fueled by belief in Jesus Christ. There's even a legend that says the book was authored by a magician named Honorius, who was given the magical formulas by an angel named Horahel. Number 5. John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe is one of the Vatican's great shames. He was an English priest and scholar who came before the Protestant Reformation. He was outspoken in the 14th century about the practices of the Church. He complained that the Church was abusive, corrupt, and so far from God they could hardly consider themselves a religious organization anymore. When John was growing up in the early 1300s, the Holy Roman Catholic Church ruled all of Europe. There were nations, sure, but the Church reigned supreme. John came up with the idea of 2 main domains. He believed in an earthly church and an idealized church. He believed the earthly church had strayed far from its origins and needed reform. In the beginning, John was relatively well protected because he had powerful and connected friends. To be this outspoken against the hierarchy would have been dangerous for anyone else. But the church was also distracted because they accidentally had 2 popes at this time, and everyone was really confused. The confusion allowed John's ideas to trickle down into the common folk. He even went ahead and translated the Bible from Latin into English, something that was forbidden. John lived a long and healthy life, despite being one of the church's biggest enemies. What's totally crazy is what happened long after he died. John's end came around 1384. Then, in 1415, 29 years after his death, he was decreed a heretic and officially excommunicated for his treachery. Then, 13 years later, in 1428, the church ordered his remains be exhumed. John's rotting corpse was dug out of the ground, burned, and thrown into the river. Number 4. Atlantis and the Vatican. There is a theory which claims the Vatican is hiding explicit knowledge of the existence of the lost city of Atlantis. Unfortunately, there's very little evidence to back up the theory, with little more than hearsay and speculation to go on. Nonetheless, if anyone does know the truth of Atlantis, it's probably the Roman Catholic Church. Plato wrote about Atlantis in 360 BC. He supposedly heard the story of Atlantis from a man named Solon, who received the information from an Egyptian priest. This Egyptian priest was a keeper of stories, a kind of human library of past events. The priest spoke of a city near the Mediterranean that came before Athens, which is generally accepted to be one of the first major cities in Greece. The civilization that lived in this mysterious place was superior to all others. They were even more powerful than the Egyptians and lived long before the pharaohs ever built their pyramids. But here's a shocking little tidbit that might surprise you. The reason the Egyptian priest knew of Atlantis and nobody else was because the tale had been passed down from generation to generation. The city of Atlantis was in Egypt, not on some mythical island, but it was destroyed by a flood, and when civilization started anew, it was the Egyptian civilization. They only had a vague memory of Atlantis, and it faded with time. Keep in mind, this is just a theory closely linked to the theory of the Atlanteans building the pyramids. The only real connection to the Vatican is that many believe they're hiding the truth. Down in their mysterious secret archives, the Vatican allegedly has documentation proving Atlantis was a real civilization that came before the Egyptians. Do you think Atlantis was a real place? Tell me in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 3. The Templars and the Ark. On October 25, 2016, the Vatican shocked the world with the release of some very secret documents. These documents were so secret that they were stashed in an archive for 700 years. The documents took the world by storm because they revealed what happened to the Knights Templar in the 1300s. The documents are the official reports written by church investigators into the supposed heretical activities of the Knights Templar. This story goes back to October of 1306. That was when the Knights Templar were found guilty of 3 major sins: heresy, blasphemy, and idolatry. After serving the church and Europe in the Crusades for 2 centuries, the Crusader Knights were rounded up and burned at the stake. Some were imprisoned, most were stripped of all titles and assets, and only a handful got away. The document released in 2016 shows how the Vatican found no evidence of heresy but condemned the Templars anyway. Pope Clement V secretly cleared the Templars of any wrongdoing, but the Vatican let them be destroyed regardless. The whole drama surrounding the destruction of the Templars had to do with King Philip IV of France. He hated the Templars because they were rich, powerful, and felt like a threat to his rule. And so the Pope bent to his will and allowed the greatest Christian knights in history to be burned like witches. While all of this was going on, the Templar lands were being picked apart by scavengers. The king and his men seized Templar properties and looted their treasures. Only they couldn't seem to find any real treasure. It was as if the Templars knew they were coming and got rid of their most valuable relics. One of these relics was said to be the Ark of the Covenant. Christian mythology says the Ark of the Covenant is a large golden box containing the 10 Commandments given to Moses. It was kept in Jerusalem until the attack of the Babylonians in 587 BC. Since then, the Ark has been missing, but many believe the Templars captured it, then hid it in a safe place somewhere the corrupt Vatican will never be able to find it. Number 2. The Roman Inquisition. We've all heard of the Spanish Inquisition, but what about the Roman Inquisition? It was one of the darkest and most horrendous times in the history of the Vatican. The Inquisition started in the early 12th century as a way to hunt down and punish a group of heretics known as Catharists. Pope Gregory, the cat hater we talked about earlier, was the one who started the whole thing in 1231. The Spanish Inquisition began in 1482, over 2 centuries later, at the behest of Pope Sextus. He appointed Inquisitor General Torquemada as the leader, charged with rooting out heretics in Spain. Torquemada was the worst possible man for the job. With him behind the wheel, torture became organized in a way it had never been before. It was like torture was given a fast food treatment. Suddenly there were heretics on every corner being tortured into confessions, and when a heretic refused to confess, they were typically burned at the stake. The Spanish Inquisition only came to an end when Torquemada got a little too ahead of himself. He decided to investigate members of the clergy. This was the wrong move for him, as the clergy has always been off limits. Pope Alexander VI immediately shut his operation down. But then came the Roman Inquisition. In 1542, Pope Paul III decided it had been too long since an Inquisition ran rampant in Europe. He created something called the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition. Yes, it's a mouthful. This Inquisition, like all the ones that came before it, was to combat heresy. But there was a twist. It was strictly to combat Protestant heresy. The Roman Inquisition is most famous for what happened to Galileo in 1633 when he was put on trial. But there was a lot of bloodshed that came earlier. When King Philip II took the throne of Spain in 1556, he was already using the Roman Inquisition to hunt down Lutherans. Lutherans all across the Netherlands were captured and burned at the stake without a trial. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the Inquisition didn't end for a very long time. It just moved. When Spain expanded into North America and South America, they brought the Inquisition with them. Even in Mexico in the 16th century, Lutherans were burned at the stake. And when the Roman Inquisition arrived in Peru, the same thing happened to the Protestants. It wasn't until Napoleon Bonaparte of France defeated Spain in 1808 that the Inquisition was finally abolished. Number 1. Orlandi developments. Just after Easter weekend in 2023, Pope Francis made some very interesting statements. Pope Francis defended Pope John Paul II after recent rumors put the former pope in a rather nasty light. The brother of Emanuela Orlandi made allegations that the former pope was a creep and specifically searched for underage girls to have inappropriate relations with. This is a huge allegation put against someone who is supposed to be the leader of all Christian nations. And yet it wouldn't be the first time the Vatican covered up a scandal involving a religious leader having inappropriate relations. The reason this new allegation has gotten so much press is that it has to do with the biggest mystery in modern Vatican history. In 1983, 15-year-old Emanuela Orlandi vanished. She was on her way home to where she lived with her family in Vatican City on June 22nd. She had just finished a flute lesson in Rome and should have been home without incident. The disappearance of the teenager has never made any sense. It's as if she vanished into thin air. She's been missing for 39 years, but her family has never stopped hunting. Some believe international terrorism was involved. Others have pointed to the Italian mafia. But by far the most popular theory is that the Holy See himself got rid of the child to cover up what could be a devastating scandal for the Church. The Vatican has always remained silent on the matter. They have denied all accusations and remained relatively neutral. That is until 2023, just about 40 years after her disappearance. Only now has Vatican City opened an official investigation. Emanuela's brother Pietro Orlandi recently appeared on an Italian talk show. On the air, he played a tape recording in which an Italian mafia member allegedly admits to Pope John Paul being brought women so that he could have his way with them. Now Pope Francis is denouncing the allegations as nonsense, but Pietro insists Pope John Paul was a sick predator, one who potentially kidnapped his sister. What do you think is the Church's darkest secret? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching. Remember to hit subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon for another shocking video.